We're deeply grateful you could join us on this rainy, gloomy day, inspired by the superb Scottish climate. So as we transition into the lecture portion of this evening, we're honored to have Dr. Andrew Pettegree joining us from University of St. Andrews, which feels only appropriate as the Masters also tees off today in Augusta. So Dr. Pettegree is a world-renowned cultural historian, having established himself as a leading voice in the study of the history of books through his scholarship and the publication of 16 monographs. You can find a more thorough outline of Dr. Pettegree's academic biography in tonight's program, but as librarians, we wanted to highlight his work as the director of the Universal Short Title Catalog, or the USTC, which is an online bibliography of all books published in the first age of print, which they categorize as 1540 to 1700. It currently contains the locations of over 4 million copies of books printed between 1450 and 1650, and links to over 250,000 full scanned items. At lunch today, we had the honor of having lunch with Dr. Pettegree, and he shared with us that every time the catalog expands 50 years, the number of records essentially doubles. So any expansion to the date range exponentially increases the amount of content. And that's not a small undertaking for their team of fewer than 10 people working on this project at a time. So despite being an historian by training, we have agreed amongst ourselves that Dr. Pettegree is an honorary librarian for his work at the USTC, but also his volume called The Library of Fragile History, which traces the evolution of libraries from ancient times to the digital present, emphasizing the resiliency of libraries as they're handed down between generations. An excellent read that I highly recommend to any fellow book nerds out there, to which I imagine this might be the proper crowd. So now that I've made all of our weather jokes, our Scotland jokes, our golf jokes, I am honored to introduce Dr. Andrew Pettegree for his keynote address, Book History's New Frontier and the Perils of Big Data.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you all for coming today and for the hospitality I've enjoyed in Emory since the beginning of the week. This is the first time I've been on campus here, and it is the most lovely place, and I've had a very good time. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Those are the first words of L.B. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between, published in 1953 in a memorable film of 1971. And I always remember this profound remark when I recall the beginnings of our book project in St. Andrews in 1995. Because for bibliographers, that was, in scholarly terms, a totally different world. Online catalogues were very much a thing of the future. Comparative bibliography relied on 19th century catalogues published by the libraries themselves, card indexes, sometimes manuscript lists, and in-person inspection of books. Sometimes when we started working on France, where we spent 10 years working up a study of 16th century French printing, we were simply directed to the stacks so we could work our way round and try and work out which were 16th century books. And in one library, we were just simply told to go up to the attic by a rather shaky ladder. And I have to say, we found a 16th century book there that we've never come across since, so it was sort of worth the danger money. So we spent the first 10 years of this project clattering around France, doling out shortbread to rare book librarians, and emphasizing in every library that we were Scottish, not English. And that seemed to do the trick. In fact, it's the only time in my life I've claimed to be Scottish. These trips were always fun, but it took until 2008 before we were ready with our first national survey, the survey of 16th century French books. Now the USTC covers the whole of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, extends to 1700, and contains over 1.5 million records. And there they all are. 1.5 million records and 4 million surviving copies. And for this acceleration of our work from 91,000 copies in 2008 to this, we've had to make use of an enormous amount of digital resources as they've become available. And in the last year, I've started writing round to libraries like the Pitts and Emory to ask them to send us a complete survey of their pre-1701 books, which over 125 libraries have done already, and this gives us another 2 million copies to match into the USDC. Now, it's a good moment, I think, to reflect on how big data has transformed book history and what it means for scholars and what we do next. But I'll start by reminding you of two pertinent facts. The first is that the USDC has been entirely created by past and present members of this St Andrews group. That is, it has not been a collaborative venture involving multiple universities. I was always against that because too much committee work. You find yourself on the train all the time rather than doing scholarship. And the second point to make is this was designed by historians. Now, I think that matters because each of the bibliographies or data projects which is designed to answer the questions that those designing it want answered. So, for instance, how much was printed in a particular place? Which authors enjoyed popularity outside their homeland, and which authors had little international appeal? To what extent did the balance of power in the print industry between printers, publishers, and booksellers change during the early modern period? What genres of work became more or less important over the centuries covered by the USDC? And did the vernacular languages make progress against Latin? And if so, when and where? So with these questions in mind, we built an open resource where you can interrogate any element of the data: printer, place of printing, author, format, language, subject. All of that can be interrogated independently without having to enter a prior search term. And in that, it differs from all of the other bibliographies we've used. Now, enriching all this data in this way, particularly with the subject classification, has been done by our team members, along with an enormous amount of work bringing all the data we got from other major projects into consistency, because of course they all use different terms and they also use different languages. So currently we have, this is a slide which shows the facets. Those are all the things there which you can look up, the country, printer, and so on and so forth. And on the right, as you look at it, you see the various subjects, not surprisingly with religious books very much in the lead. This is the growth of print output as revealed in the USDC, and you can see after the huge leap from the incunabula period to the first half of the 16th century, from that point onwards it's chugging up as doubling the previous total every 50 years. So, for instance, it goes from 400,000 to 700,000. So what that means is, if we were to attempt to include the 18th century here, it's 1.5 million now, so it would probably be 3 million for the first half of this 18th century, and then exponentially larger. So that really would need some younger people to undertake it, and a considerable amount of time. And then below you see my estimate for the size of editions and how many copies that transfers to, an accumulative total of about over 1 billion printed works would have been in circulation by the year 1700. But that's assuming only those which we can identify now. Taking into account lost books, it was probably near 2 billion. So that means even if we get into eventually to 10 million copies in the USDC, that will still be only 0.1% of the copies which were originally printed. The level of loss is quite astonishing. Now, we've had something like 600,000 unique users since we launched the USDC in 2011. And most of them find these approaches useful. But I think there are consequences, both of our design choices and our working methods, which I want to make clear to you now. Firstly, much as we've struggled to create consistency, the data that we've ingested invariably varies in quality. In a project this large, it's not possible to see every book, and therefore to check the accuracy of the records we've relied upon. When different libraries make conflicting claims for the physical qualities of a work, its format or pagination, we have to make decisions about which to adopt as our master record. And this is particularly acute with small formats of books, which are actually quite difficult to catalogue. So we might have the same book described as a 12mo, an 18mo, a 24mo, or a 32mo. And we have to decide which we think it is. Sometimes we stray on the side of creating a separate master record, creating an edition that possibly does not exist on the basis of poor cataloguing in the library. So it's not unfair to say that the USDC contains many records which require revisiting. It can only be as good as the data we receive and we inherit from the World Library community. But this open policy of recording everything we can is very different from the principles of national bibliography, which has previously been predominant, to which I will now turn. National bibliographies have a very different starting point from the USDC. They aim to offer a survey of the production of a particular nation or language area based on in-person examination of the stock, in-person examination of the stock of libraries in their own country or language zone. Now, this has produced some very important resources. The Short Title Catalogue Netherlands, Short Title Catalogue Flanders, VD 16 and 17, the German national bibliographies, and Edit Sedici, the Italian 16th century bibliography. But I will argue today that all of those three central tenets that underpins national bibliography are flawed. We'll come on to that, but first, let's recognize that the limitations of national bibliographies are further compounded by acts of self-harming. First, the decision to exclude single sheet items. When the VD 16, the German National Survey of German books printed in the 16th century, excluded broadsheets, it's really quite hard to understand why they did it. The canonical models of bibliography, the English short title catalogue and the incunabula short title catalogue, both include single sheet materials. And the decision to exclude them from the German survey has been described to be by one German bibliographer as the most disastrous decision in the history of bibliography. Now, this didn't stop the Dutch following suit in the short title catalogue Netherlands. Workers on that project have described to me going through volumes of pamphlets, and if they found a single sheet item which they folded out, They simply folded it back up and ignored it and went on to the next. And that is particularly destructive because it never may be found again. Now, both of those projects have since reversed their decisions, and VD17 does include broadsheets, but the damage is done, as I think we can see from this. Now, that's the German broadsheets to 1650 in the USTC, and as you see, there's quite a lot of incunabula there, and there's quite a lot of 17th century ones, but you should see a constant curve upwards, and you can see how much work still has to be done to repair the damage. Most of the 15th, 16th century ones there are ones that we've put in, but there must be many, many more in German libraries and in German archives. All national bibliographies also exclude newspapers, or if they include them, they're seldom described as on an issue level. Collectively, these two exclusions may deprive their national bibliographies of close to half of all the printed publications in the 17th century. There's no reason newspapers should be excluded. If you exclude a pamphlet, which is often made with a sheet of paper, the issue of a newspaper is as consequential as that pamphlet, and to distinguish between them is quite wrong. But let's return to the three governing principles of national bibliography. In-person examination of the stock of libraries in their own country. Now, in-person examination is undoubtedly the gold standard of bibliography, but it's also slow and very expensive. Given that most national bibliographies have now run to the end of their project budgets, to make progress depends on libraries allowing their own staff to contribute free of charge to the receiving national bibliography, which is how, for instance, the Dutch National Bibliography has all the Dutch books in Cambridge libraries added to them. Insisting on in-person examination means that the bibliography will always be incomplete. The short title catalogue Flanders, Belgium if you like, for instance, lists only 10% of the incunabula published in the southern Netherlands, because there's only that 10% in the libraries they've visited. The concentration on libraries is also a fatal flaw. A great deal of the printed output of the early modern period survives, if it survives at all, exclusively in archives. And this is particularly the case for official print and forms of this sort. And this is the sort of work that we've been doing to try and fill the gaps. This is a wonderful instance. This is a broadsheet has been published in Zutphen to advertise their horse market. Now, the broadsheet doesn't survive, so we've put it in anyway as a lost book. But those are the itineraries of the town messengers being sent to these various towns to spread the word and the villages in between. It's a unique record. I've never seen anything like that before. And these are those itineraries. As you see, they're going an awful long way from Zutphen. And the fact they all stretch northwards suggests to me that there must certainly be 3 more itineraries which simply don't survive in the records. Now, archives are a complicated environment for bibliographers because their holdings are catalogued in a totally different way. In a library, a book will be catalogued according to well-understood principles, which is one of the reasons that broadsheets are so hard, because they don't have a title page, so you have to have totally different principles for how you deal with those. But if you go to an archive, you might find yourself looking at a file called Ordinances of the City of Haarlem, 1635 to 1789. You have no idea how many items are in there. You have no idea how many are 17th century, which makes it very good fun when you go, but you could be going to catalogue just one work, which is an outrider, and all the others are too late. But it does mean that there's a huge number of finds to be made for historians of print in archives. But the most damaging limitation is that national bibliographies tend to confine their in-person work to libraries within their own national domain. In other words, the Germans look at German libraries, the Italians look at Italian libraries, and so forth. Now, in financial terms, that makes perfect sense. It cuts down on secondary costs, travel and accommodation, and national funding bodies actually like the money to stay within their own national domain. But this working principle is completely at odds with the reality of the early modern book world, where the smooth functioning of the international book market meant that books could end up hundreds of miles away from their place of first publication. And there they remain. German books in Spain, Italian books in France, and Dutch books just about everywhere. Now, these will elude the surveys of national bibliographies by definition. And we've found that when we've done this sort of work, we'll find, let's say that the VD17 has 10 copies of a book, all in German libraries, but we'll find 35 others arranged around the world's libraries. So that is actually very important because it tells you quite a lot about the relative range of these book texts and their interest. When we worked on 16th century France, right back at the beginning of this project, we found 30% of our registered titles were present in no French library. When we surveyed 16th century printing in the Low Countries, we increased the number of known editions for the southern Netherlands by 63%. A more recent exercise I conducted for the USTC was a survey of the print output of Strasbourg between 1651 and 1700. Now, Strasbourg is unusual because it's claimed by two national bibliographies. The German, because it was German-speaking at the time, and the French national bibliography, because it's in France now. So this seemed to me an ideal opportunity to compare how the two matched up. Well, the German National Bibliography offers 3,393 records for books published in Strasbourg between 1651 and 1700. The French Répertoire Bibliographique, based mostly now on French libraries, but also some records from major libraries elsewhere in Europe and the United States, offers 2,105. Now, of those 3,393 VD17 records, 1,283 are also in the Répertoire Bibliographique. So the German resource has 2,110 records which are not in the French National Bibliography. Now, okay, the Venn diagram. Conversely, the Répertoire Bibliographique has 882 records unknown to the German National Bibliography. Collectively, then, if you take in both, you have a total of 4,215 records. And of those 4,215, only 30% of them are recognized in both bibliographies. Now, if we add a further 991 records which the project group unearthed in other sources, mostly the catalogues of libraries not consulted by either National Bibliography, we get a total of 5,206. And of this title, the French Répertoire Bibliographique has only 40%, and the German VD17, 65%. Now, these figures should surely give us pause, because these two respective national surveys are frequently treated as surrogates for the entire publication output. Now, this is perhaps my greatest concern, and I will turn to what we're doing to address this in the USDC shortly. But first, we must address what one might call the two convenient untruths of bibliography. First, the assumption that we can reconstruct the reading experience of the inhabitants of any part of Europe from the contents of their national bibliography. Secondly, that what survives in libraries today offers a representative sample of what was originally published. They're convenient, but they're both nonsense. Now, the first of these is patently untrue, is easily demonstrated from the stock of any bookshop that has left a record from the 16th and 17th centuries, and the catalogues of private libraries sold at auction in the 17th century. And it's a great help to us that book auctions became so popular in the 17th century, because that's transformed our approach to working on the 17th century. Now, what these catalogues tell us is that the international book trade functioned extremely successfully to bring to your local bookshop works published from all over the continent. And those who wanted to read were by no means confined to the products of their local national culture. Now, it can, of course, be argued that that applies particularly to the Latinate, who would buy books from Paris, Amsterdam, or Venice, irrespective of their location of publication. What they wanted was a text, and in the right size for their reading purposes. But what about vernacular books? Were those different? Well, yes, they were, but here we run into our other problem, that we can scarcely do justice to the reading experience of our ancestors if we're wholly dependent on the present contents of our major libraries. What we can call either the Eisenstein delusion or the Searle predicament, the idea that you are just looking at what libraries have. Now, in fairness to Elizabeth Eisenstein, who wrote the canonical text about the print revolution in the early modern period, she wrote her landmark book in a very different era, when online catalogues were not even thought of. Her work was largely conducted in great collections like the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the library at Harvard. It's no wonder that she was enthralled by the progressive potential of great ideas and magnificent books. But books like the ones you can consult in our great libraries survived for a reason. That was that they were intended for consultation rather than intensive reading, and in many cases, they were not greatly read at all. It's one of the rather difficult working truths of bibliography that the books which survive today are often survive because they weren't much read. When we did our work in France, we found ourselves working mostly in city libraries, not university libraries, as a result of the French Revolution, when all these books were gifted to the municipal libraries. And so these books would be brought out, and we'd sort of open them up, these massive folios. They would give a great crack, and you would know that no one had really opened this book for 200 years. So if there is a correlation between survival and contemporary interest, it will be inverse. That is, that the books that were most intensively read are the least likely to survive today. Now, a dramatic illustration of this point was provided by the researches of Simon Burrows, who's consistently argued the continued importance of religious texts in French book purchasing right up to the end of the 18th century. Now, that's quite a brave argument because, of course, for everyone else it's Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, and so on. Now, the most dramatic demonstration of this is the ubique presence of the Ange Conducteur, you see it here, a counter-Reformation devotional manual first published in 1681 and still hugely popular 100 years later. Here you see the copies licensed by the Paris police to be published. Of the top 10 works identified by official searches of this sort and published as stock in the decades before the French Revolution, this is a decade before the French Revolution, Enlightenment in full swing, 8 of the top 10 are religious texts like this. And the other 2 are not texts of political thought. The only other two to break into this elite were 2 further mundane texts, a Latin primer and an accounting textbook, the Confé, which you see here in 3rd place. Between 1778 and 1789, permission was granted for no fewer than 32 editions of this little accounting book. Lots of aspirant tradesmen wanted this. Yet, Simon Burroughs' search of WorldCat revealed only 11 surviving copies of the Ange Conducteur and 18 of the accounting textbook for the years 1759 to 1789. Big span. A search for Voltaire's Candide for these same years revealed 165 hits. This, though sobering, is hardly a surprise, since, as Simon puts it, the humdrum business of elementary education, business management, and the glorification of God has seldom held the attention of the librarians and scholars outside Pitt's Theological College, who built our research collections. It's a clear demonstration, this obsession with Voltaire, how the priorities of scholarship distort not only the realities of the past, but also the contents of libraries. So what can we do to rebalance an understanding of the actual early modern book world rather than the small subsection that interests intellectual historians? Well, here's what we're trying to do about it in St. Andrews. In the USTC, Universal Short Title Catalogue, something like a quarter of all books registered are present in only a single copy. That makes it statistically certain that many other books will have survived in 1 fewer copies, that is 0. And if you do a negative regression, you see the trends moving up, so that number with 0 copies will be extremely large. Scholars like Paul Needham and Neil Harris have already remarked on this with regard to particular genres such as prose romances. And it's also true that rates of loss vary very widely depending on the genre. Catechisms subject to ferocious level of loss, almanacs. But against that, Alan Farmer has demonstrated, I think quite persuasively, that something like 80% of the play texts that were published still survive. And that's because they were collected together into volumes very soon after their first publication. So what do we do about this? Is it not better, safer, as one recent author put it, simply to continue as if what has survived was in fact everything that was printed, and do our statistical analysis on that basis? The problem for that particular author is that this safety-first approach led to decidedly unsafe conclusions. Concluding, for instance, that the absence of a single copy of a second edition of a particular book proves that one was never printed. Well, you can't argue on those lines. So what to do? In the last years, we've given a lot of thought to this in St. Andrews. And what we find is that actually a lot can be done to recover the lost books of early modern Europe, and that's one of our primary goals. First, we have the numbered series, things like newspapers. I think even the most skeptical would probably agree that if numbers 5 and 15 of a newspaper survive, then numbers 1 to 4 and the others probably were printed in the first place. So in they go. We have a lot of lost books of newspaper. Then we have booksellers where people talk of the 15th edition. Those are probably implies there were previous editions. And academic dissertations where professors, rather immodestly sometimes, preside over a series of dissertations by their students, 15 dissertations, let's say, on the errors of Cardinal Bellarmine, very popular subject, and yet they don't all survive. Recently, we found in Leiden a Strasbourg dissertation from 1644, which was the 57th in a series. A good rule in all scholarship is that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. However, we did look it up in WorldCat, and we found 3 earlier ones in the sequence. So we now had 4 out of 57, so we inferred 53 lost books as a result of this process. Academic dissertations are particularly good from this, and they're among the least well catalogued books from the 17th century because everyone thinks they're dull. Actually, they're fascinating, but I do remember in one German library, I think it was Gotha, we were being given a conducted tour, and we went past a beautiful iron-barred door, wooden door with lots of locks on. And I said, well, what's that? And he said with a sort of shiver, oh, that's the thesis room. And there was basically a whole room of these academic theses which were not catalogued and were never going to be catalogued as far as they were, unless the USDC team goes round. Publisher stock is another very good source of lost books, particularly because they deal in vernacular books. And so we're not just recovering lots of Latin books. Advertisements too. Those are some of the book auctions we've been using. These are from Denmark, and they're extremely good collections. And then there's advertisements as well. But this is what we're going to do. 2 things with this. What we do is we treat every one of these records in catalogues like this. We transcribe them into a Access database, and then we treat them as if they're books. And then when we bring things like the Pitts books into a list, we also bring in these auction catalogue data and bookstock data. And that's going to give us 2 things. It's going to give us lots of books which we can't find surviving copies of, which now then enter the USDC as a new master record. But it's also going to tell us quite a lot of who are the owners of these books. We call this book profiling. So, for instance, this is a pretty run-of-the-mill medical text, and those are all the people who own it, their profession, where they live, and the price they've paid for it, where that is also specified, which is quite unusually. So that's something we're developing at the moment, but we'll do, it's slightly different from provenance studies, which depend on handwritten notes in books, but it's another approach to how many people own it. And sometimes we have more lists, we have more owners listed than we have surviving copies now. Then what about lost books? I'll give you 3 examples of different types of lost books and where we get with this. This is a very, very popular Roman history, and one of the things about the Roman classics is they're sort of cradle-to-grave books. They play an important part in the syllabus of education, but then they're read for pleasure later in life, and so constantly new editions are published. And this is what we know from the short title catalogue, Netherlands, of editions published in the Dutch Republic between 1585 and 1649. A lot. But this is what we have when we add the ones from catalogues and other things. We have almost doubled the popularity of Valerius Maximus. This was my favorite exercise, actually. This is more work done by my colleague Arthur de Vader, and you can see that the level of loss varies very greatly between the various Latin authors. So in some cases, we almost double the number known. In some cases, we make a much more modest addition. But the overall impact is to increase by, or at least 60% what the total. A lot of this information comes from newspapers. In the first age of the newspaper, most of the advertisements related to books. And what's good about this is that many of the books are vernacular books. They don't tend to advertise Latin books in newspapers. And when we tried matching all of these into the USDC, which we did before Arthur published his study, we found by 1650 there were 1,230 books advertised. We matched 58% of those to the short title catalogue of the Netherlands. We matched another 85 editions to extra work we put into the USDC, and we found that 35% of them were lost books. So this gave us another 430 lost books in the USDC. And here's the language breakdown, and you see that newspapers are by and large advertising books in the more accessible formats, for quarto and smaller, very few folios being advertised. Now we use this work on advertisements in this next project relating to the Catechism of Gellius de Baume, which was, according not least to himself, an extremely popular book in 17th century Netherlands. But you wouldn't necessarily think so if you went to the short title catalogue Netherlands. It's relatively well represented, but it's not really, these are not bestseller numbers when you've got 7 editions in 12 years. So then what we did was we went back to these bookstock catalogues, advertisements, and something called a sort of survey of all the books published in the Netherlands between precisely these dates, which is why we chose these dates. That's one of the advertisements in a newspaper with, there's his work. This is some of the copies in the stock catalogue in different formats, different editions. Slightly later stock catalogue, you can see between 1649 and 1665, he's beginning to drift out of popularity. And this is what we end up with. You start with the 7, and you can make it up to 21 with these advertisements, the Catalogus Universalis, and these 2 book stock catalogues. And the great advantage of this, of course, is that they verify each other. If you're saying, oh, perhaps there's a typo in the catalogue or something, when it begins to appear in more than one independent source, and in one case, in 4 different sources, you realize it probably exists. Now, this is a slide I keep on vowing to take out because everyone's much more interested in the heart-shaped book that they are in my wise words on it. This is another piece of work done by Arthur de Vader, and this is a very popular prayer book by a German theologian translated into Dutch. And the level of loss here, because it's a prayer book, used to death, by the time your parents are deceased, you have your own copy in your own household, you don't really need their books. And this is what we found here. We found 47 lost editions in the various catalogues we've been through. We found another 8 in newspapers. So a 500% increase, six times the total. Putting all this together, I should say we also have archive references which give us not individual lost books, but an idea of just how extensive it is. In 1659, the town printer received this huge sum, 1,843 guilders, for the printing of ordinances. And we work out, if, depending on the edition size, this would be a minimum of 200 separate editions, but only 2 copies, that is 2 copies of these 200 editions survive today, both in a single surviving copy. But of course these are not really meant to survive, they're meant to be posted up on, and the weather gets to them, and then they are posted over with something else. They're purely everyday print, but for many people in places like Amsterdam, this would be the most important thing they read. You know, if it said the chicken market has been moved from Friday to Wednesday and you took your chickens on Friday, you might get them confiscated. So you had to follow these sort of things. Anyway, putting all this together, Arthur and I tried to make an estimate of the likely total output of the presses of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. And this caused a bit of a stooshy, because the STC Netherlands was originally minded to claim that it now contained 90% of all that was published in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, and we make it near 20%. Now, the Dutch periodical to which we submitted this work wouldn't publish it on the grounds that it was too systematic. Now, that's not a criticism I've ever heard before of historical work. We did publish it eventually in an international journal, but it does demonstrate how sensitive this was. Now, you could say, does this really matter? Does it matter how many broadsheet ballots survive if we have enough representative editions to get a sense of what was going on? And it doesn't really matter if that represents less than 1% or 30% of what was originally published. Now, I don't really buy that. I think quantity matters. Quantity matters because that's what this is the sort of work that makes money for printers. You print 200 copies of an ordinance or 50 copies of an academic dissertation. The unfortunate student has to buy the lot and then distribute them free of charge. The 200 ordinances will all go to one single client. Now, compared to the process of publishing a book, which then has to go out on the market to the Frankfurt Fair, that's costly, and then to a bookseller who has to get their markup, what the printer is getting is only a small proportion of the total, whereas anything printed for a single client is the ideal thing because you get the entire value of the work. Let's think of academic dissertations, for instance, an enormous amount of publishing, which was paid directly to the printer. And it was the contract to publish academic dissertations at Leiden that enabled the Elsevier's to take a risk on Galileo. And it's Galileo, of course, that made their reputation, but it was the academic dissertations that made the money. So much money, in fact, that the students frequently complained that they were too expensive and inaccurately done. Now, the overall impact on the Dutch Republic can be summed up in 2 further pie charts, which I have to say astonished me when I first saw them. That is, of the corpus of 17th century Dutch printing, more than 3/4 consisted of 2 sheets or less. That is 2 pieces of paper folded up to make pamphlets or whatever. That surprised me a great deal, but one of the things you can do when you've got an edition is you can work out how many sheets were used for each. Of course, the Dutch Republic isn't known for these little books, it's known for the big books, the great atlases, the great folios. And then this. Now, we all have a pretty clear sense of what a book is. It's a volume which the publisher, a printer, sends to the bookshop and we buy it. Well, not in the 17th century Dutch Republic. Over half of all the printed items published were distributed for free. Others were subscription, like newspapers, like the share prices, which were produced on a weekly basis. So the normal process of book buying we think of, that is retail, accounts for less than a quarter of what was published. And that's very significant because it means that although many Dutch citizens gathered together huge libraries, very distinguished libraries, we know that because their children auctioned them off to make some money, and we have catalogues. But that's not how most people got their information. You could read a lot in the 17th century Dutch Republic without buying ever a single book. Now I'm going to end with a little bit of whimsy of my own, following in the footsteps of Colin Burrows, reintroducing you to a strange project called Printing and the Mind of Man. Here it is. And this called together a collection of the great scholars to identify the 50 most important books in the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, and 18th century. So I thought it would be interesting to look and see how much read these important books are. So we took our 500,000 pieces of data from the catalogues to find out who were the contemporary bestsellers. Well, they weren't living people. They weren't people from that era. By and large, they were the ancients. So we find 1750 works of Cicero, and so on and so forth. Religious books remained extremely important. 1500, almost 1500 Calvins, and so on. And the rest of all these people are, this is a Protestant country, so no surprises, a lot of Protestants, but old Bellarmine gets in there, the grit in the oyster of these Protestant theologians. Oh, but here we are, Printing in the Mind of Man, and this is the number of copies they held of these distinguished, significant authors. Now, the project was always going to be flawed because 50% of the books they chose were written in English, a language spoken by only about 5% of the population of Europe at that time. You see, Cervantes made a reasonable fist of it, but the English authors not so much. This is how Robert Darnton sums it up. Historians have always taken what a society writes, publishes and reads as a guide to its culture, but they've never taken all its books as guidebooks. Instead, they select a few works as representative of the whole and settle down to write intellectual history. Now, Robert Darnton's a strange ally in a way, but what he was talking about was his own, what he was trying to get us to turn our attention to was the pornography that he'd been working on that came in from Neuchâtel. So what the USTC offers, I think, is a route map back to empiricism, to looking at what the people of these centuries wanted for themselves rather than what scholars many centuries later find more interesting. So here are my key takeaways. The books we admire today were not necessarily contemporary bestsellers. The books collected by our great libraries are not an adequate guide to contemporary reading. So-called ephemeral print was not at all ephemeral, either to the readers or to publishers. Readers were by no means confined to the product of the local press, and opening up new fronts, registers of readers and archival evidence is essential to understanding the book world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'll start. And as a librarian, I feel a bit attacked here. But I'm curious what you think, because I'm just turning over my head. When we think about collecting, or particularly around digitizing, oftentimes it's for lack of a better term, the sexy books that we want to get out there. So what advice or what would you hope for libraries in order to help fulfill the kind of things you've pointed out here?
Well, I think librarians are in a bit of a bind here, because although we're trying to do this job, there's no central way you can report all the books that you have digitized or want to digitize. We had a program with the Mellon Foundation called Preserving the World's Rarest Books, which ran for 4 years. And the idea is we would give people from the USDC a list of all their books, arranged in order of how many copies we had, starting with 1. Now, obviously, what should be a major priority for your digitization program is books which only survive in 1 copy, or books which have no other copy in America. Now, it's very difficult to keep on top of that because so many libraries are digitizing constantly, and so it's quite difficult for the USDC to play catch up. But one of the things we're doing at the moment with some help from undergraduates is going through available sources to try and find more of these digital copies. And we find already for some books we've got 25 digital copies of a book. Now, a scholar, a bibliographer would say there's no problem with that because they'll have different marginalia or no marginalia or some coloring here and others there. But I would really urge you to, any library, to start with the unique items and make sure that some catastrophe, either theft or fire, doesn't destroy the only copy of a book. They've had a hard enough time getting to the 21st century without losing it here.
And we have a microphone here, and so if you don't mind asking a question through the microphone, that would be most helpful for those who are attending virtually. So if you have questions, please come forward to the microphone.
It's like a political convention, isn't it?
That was really a fascinating paper, and it reminded me of, you probably remember back in the 60s, one of the issues in Enlightenment intellectual history was the relationship between the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the French Revolution. This was debated, and the question, some of the questions you raised actually, I think, came out of that. The tendency to equate intellectual influence with a book is, and political influence is obviously really problematic, but one response to this controversy, which I think involved a scholar who showed that actually there weren't that many copies of this social contract in print, and therefore his influence was limited. But one response was that in the 18th century, and in general, in the early modern period, one became acquainted with ideas the ideas found in a book, not through the book itself, but through quotations from the book, from reproductions, in anthologies, or reproductions of paragraphs.
Yeah.
So that I guess that's one of the things you're getting at. Mm-hmm. How do we define the book, and has the whole idea of the book as a as a carrier of intellectual influence.
Yeah.
Been really misunderstood.
Yeah.
And just a plug for Pitt's Library. There is, you were talking about dissertations, and there's really an incredible collection of German doctoral dissertations from the 17th and 18th century. It must be one of the best in the country. So if you haven't told him about it. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I think the poor old French Revolution, its causes have been completely changed in my lifetime. I mean, when I started, it was all the sans-culottes and being hungry which led to the French Revolution, and they wouldn't have been interested in Rousseau at all. Now there's a lot of interest in singing as a way of bonding in that period. But I think this is one of the problems of the history of communication more generally, and that is it's always treated as if innovation in communication is sequential, which it's not. It's cumulative. You know, every time there's a new invention, people say, oh, that will kill this, or that will kill that. Whereas in fact, consumers are much wiser. We incorporate the new into our lives without necessarily giving up the old. When you think of it, when people learned to write for the first time, they didn't stop speaking. So why should we think that the 21st century is any different? But what I can say from being a historian of communication, every new communication innovation is greeted with a sort of storm of false prophecy. And what people think an innovation like the internet or television or the cinema is going to bring, it's always something totally different, because people adapt intelligently to all of these new innovations. And they don't give up. They don't need to give up what they liked doing before. Sorry, sir.
Enjoyed that very much. I have a question. What role is there for private collectors who may have amassed a good deal and have done a good job of documenting what they have? What role is there for the U.S.? For example, the Rotary Club overtures made there to say access to your collection.
Yes, we include both the books of private institutions. For instance, we have had a download recently from the Grolier Club, so those will in due course appear in the USDC. But I should explain to you all, that with these 2 million pieces of data to go in, the only way to do it is to do it by place, by location. So for instance, I've recently been working with the master list for Heidelberg to 1700, and all the data we've got from all the different libraries goes in together. Because that means sometimes you can add 45 copies with one single action. So it's very economical in terms of time, and it means that you get to know a place well when you're deciding whether something is new or not. If we were to do it the other way and simply take the Pitt's list and say we'll match all of those, you'd be matching across many countries, whereas we're giving them to subject experts in the German imprints and the Italian imprints. Of course, if a library wishes to mark up everything with USDC numbers, i.e. do the matching themselves, then they can go in immediately. And for some of the very small collections, we have been able to do that. Now, as for private collecting, we do have lots of private copies in. But first of all, you have to discuss with the owner of a private collection what conditions they wish to apply to it, whether they wish it to be marked as the Andrew Pettegree collection, or private collection St. Andrews, or just private collection. Because it may be that some people want, particularly a rare book, to be signaled in the USDC, but they may not necessarily want for the location to be made known. We do the same actually for the National Trust, that we will take in their books and the house they're in, but we won't give them class marks because it makes them too vulnerable.
That was awesome, thank you. So 2 questions. One is reissues, where you'll have sometimes not explicitly marked in a catalogue. It's the same edition, and they've just somebody's just reprinted it or printed a new title page. Evidence that the book isn't selling, but it appears to go through 7 different editions.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of maybe a counter argument. Is there? I found myself, having to go through and read collation statements and say, oh, this is actually just the same book still on the market 20 years later.
Yeah.
So is there a way of not trusting the bibliographic record and undoing that work within USTC? That's question 1. And I think relatedly, I've found quite frequently, especially in Italian catalogues, that the digital record is generated from one institution and just dumped into another institution's catalogue, presumably because of underfunding, and that you get extremely unreliable, supposedly copy-specific data, which are just kind of not quite ghosts, but there's something deeply unreliable about them. Is there a way of undoing digital self-replication, those kind of ghost records?
Well, it's worse even than that, Nick, because a lot of the cataloguing being done in Europe is being done by outsourcing previous physical records to be rekeyed, often in parts of Asia, by people who are not bibliographers but are simply typing for them. Now, that is where I think we get the most error, and it depends what the error is. If you have, a book written by Voltaire in 1455, I think we'll spot that one. That's not likely to be true. What we say is that each master record represents a bibliographically distinct item. Okay? So we're not saying it's a separate edition. So it might be bibliographically distinct in the case, for instance, in the Paris market in the 1530s and 40s. A publication would often be published by a consortium of booksellers, and each would have a 1/6 of the edition with their mark in the title page. Now, the French bibliography puts them all together. We put them separately because the fact that that arrangement has been come to seems to us to be sufficiently important. We should signal it. What you are calling attention to is you've got existing stock, you slap on a title page, sometimes also with a new preface, and off it goes in a new guise. Well, that is bibliographically distinct in our terms. And yes, it can give the impression that a book is more popular than they thought. But I wouldn't be so worried about it happening 7 times every 20 years, because you may know of examples, but by and large, re-editions are set up from existing print editions. So the fact that they're the same number of pages and the same collation doesn't raise my suspicions in that case as much as it raises yours.